It began as a whisper in the night, a subtle shift, so quiet and unassuming that not even the most sensitive instruments picked it up right away. The moon had altered course, not in some dramatic blazing arc across the sky, but in a quiet defiance of the gravitational harmony that had ruled the Earth-Moon system for billions of years. At first, astronomers noticed it with vague concern. A few odd readings, small inconsistencies in tide tables. But soon, their suspicions turned into dread. The moon was no longer orbiting at a safe distance. It was falling, slowly, steadily, but undeniably falling toward Earth. For most people, the sky looked unchanged. The moon still rose. It still glowed with its pale serenity. Poets still wrote about it, and lovers still pointed toward it on warm summer nights. But beneath that surface calm, the laws of physics were unraveling. Humanity, long protected by the invisible forces of gravity and inertia, was about to face the consequence of celestial betrayal. At first, the consequences seemed mild. Tides crept a little higher than normal. Beaches disappeared slightly earlier each day. It was easy to ignore. Just another symptom of climate change, some thought. But marine biologists noticed unusual patterns in sea life. Coral reefs began bleaching at an accelerated pace. Shorebirds abandoned their nesting grounds. Entire schools of fish migrated in chaotic, unfamiliar directions. Something primal in the natural order was being disrupted, and every living thing could feel it, even if we couldn't explain it yet. It wasn't until the moon crossed the 300,000-kilometer threshold that the world began to panic. Tides now surged unpredictably. Massive waves crashed into shorelines in places that had never known such violence. Coastal towns flooded not just during storms, but on clear, sunny days. People began to flee the coasts in waves. Refugee convoys choked highways. Supermarkets were emptied. Panic spread faster than the water. From space, the Earth was changing color. Satellites showed a creeping band of silver and blue expanding along every continent's edge. What had once been land was now ocean. But as the tides grew, so did the gravitational strain on the planet itself. At 250,000 kilometers, Earth's crust began to crack. Seismic events, once rare, became routine. Entire tectonic plates strained against the pull of the moon's mass. Earthquakes erupted across fault lines that had been dormant for centuries. In San Francisco, the Bay Bridge snapped in two. In Istanbul, centuries-old mosques collapsed like dominoes. In Tokyo, the skyline buckled as steel and concrete twisted under the force of the ground beneath it. But the most terrifying force was not beneath us. It was above. The moon now loomed monstrously in the sky. It no longer looked like a distant ornament. It filled the heavens like an invading god. Its craters were visible to the naked eye in brutal, unforgiving detail. Children cried at the sight. Adults stared in horrified awe. Myth returned. People revived old legends of lunar dragons, sky gods, celestial punishers. In the absence of explanation, fear became religion again. Scientists raced to inform the public, but their words fell short. How do you explain that the very thing that had regulated life on Earth, the moon that had steadied the tides, stabilized our seasons, and guided navigation for thousands of years, was now a weapon of mass extinction? Volcanic activity spiked around the world. Dormant volcanoes roared back to life. Mount Rainier, long considered a sleeping giant, exploded with the force of a nuclear blast, blanketing the Pacific Northwest in ash. In Italy, Vesuvius awakened again, driving millions from the region. Indonesia, a country built atop volcanic bones, became a fountain of magma. The sky turned gray, then brown, then black. Sunlight dimmed. Crops failed. A global food shortage began, with supply chains already crippled by natural disasters and mass migration. As fields turned fallow, economies collapsed, governments fell. Civil unrest spread like fire on dry grass. Martial law was declared in dozens of countries. But there was no army large enough to stop the moon, no wall high enough, no strategy strong enough. With each passing day, the moon pulled harder. And Earth, stretched between survival and surrender, began to fracture in more than just land. It fractured socially. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Communities hoarded supplies, cities sealed their borders, airports closed. The last planes lifted off not to escape, but to reach mountain zones still above the flood lines. What happened next would change the shape of the Earth forever. As the moon reached 100,000 kilometers from Earth, everything accelerated. The tidal forces surged past anything humanity had ever recorded. 30-meter waves smashed against continents with unstoppable fury, not just once a day, but with every rotation of the planet. Entire coastal nations were wiped off the map. The Netherlands became a memory. Bangladesh swallowed. The eastern seaboard of the United States lay beneath a new ocean. The once bustling heartbeats of New York and Miami now drifted silently beneath silt and saltwater. But even those who had moved inland discovered that nowhere was safe. The moon, massive and indifferent, was no longer a force of myth. It was real, inescapable, and present in every moment of survival. Its pull on Earth grew stronger with every hour, and the consequences rippled through the core of the planet. The crust groaned and buckled. Earthquakes struck not just along fault lines, but in regions that had never seen seismic activity. Ancient mountains shifted, valleys split, rivers changed direction, volcanic eruptions became constant, not one or two isolated blasts, but dozens at a time. Fire bursting from the Earth's surface like open wounds. The Ring of Fire was no longer a geological boundary. It was a planetary fracture, bleeding lava and gas into the atmosphere. Across Indonesia, Japan, the west coast of North and South America, entire populations were swallowed by pyroclastic flows or buried under ash that fell like apocalyptic snow. And still the moon loomed larger. At this point, the atmosphere had become a war zone. The moon's pull distorted not only the surface, but the very currents of the sky. Superstorms evolved into climate monsters. Hurricanes no longer followed coastlines, but roamed like predators. They spawned tornadoes inland, winds shrieking with fury, lifting cars, trees, entire homes as though they were made of paper. Lightning lashed constantly. It was no longer a rare strike, but an unending flicker across the sky, setting fire to the forests that hadn't already been drowned. In the face of total breakdown, people did what they could. Nations tried to organize. Emergency shelters sprang up in mountain regions. Bunkers were reopened and reinforced, and high-elevation cities became sanctuaries. But infrastructure couldn't hold. There were too many people, too few resources, roads were impassable, power grids failed one by one, communication lines dropped, the world went dark. Then, as if summoned by some ancient curse, the moon reached 18,000 kilometers. This was the Roche limit, the threshold where Earth's gravity overpowers the cohesion of any nearby celestial body. And the moon, held together by its own internal structure for billions of years, began to break apart. First, cracks split across its surface. Deep, jagged lines spread like fractures in glass. Then came the crumbling. Chunks of lunar rock, some the size of small cities, began to fall away. It wasn't an explosion. It was disintegration. A slow, elegant collapse of something ancient and divine. The moon didn't crash into Earth, it shattered. Billions of fragments, from dust particles to asteroid-sized boulders, swirled into orbit around our planet. They didn't fall all at once. They circled. They collided. They formed a chaotic, roiling halo of destruction. Earth now had rings. From the surface, it was beautiful, haunting, majestic, a celestial crown of silver dust and glowing rock, but beauty meant nothing. These were not distant Saturn-like rings composed of harmless ice. They were daggers in the sky. Their collisions sent meteors careening toward the planet. Firestorms descended at random. A calm blue sky would suddenly burst into flame as burning rocks streaked through the atmosphere, crashing into fields, forests, homes. Cities untouched by floods or quakes were reduced to ash in seconds. Skies blackened with soot and ash. The sun, once the giver of life, now struggled to reach the surface through the thickening veil. Temperatures dropped drastically. The planet cooled. Crops failed not from flooding or fire, but from lack of light. What food remained was hoarded or stolen. Starvation spread. Cannibalism appeared in the darkest corners of the Earth. The debris in orbit wasn't just attacking from above. It also destroyed our future. Satellites were torn to shreds. There were no eyes in the sky, no more internet, no GPS, no global weather monitoring, no telecommunications. We could no longer send or receive signals. The world was blind and mute. Entire countries were cut off from one another. There was no warning before the next storm, no coordination of rescue, just isolation and silence. And then came the oxygen crisis. Photosynthesis faltered. Forests, already burned and flooded, stopped producing. Phytoplankton, responsible for over half of the oxygen we breathe, died in the oceans, suffocated by lack of light. The air began to thin. It happened slowly at first. Dizziness, fatigue, shortness of breath. But then came the hypoxia. Especially for those living at high altitudes, oxygen became dangerously scarce. Breathing was no longer a given. It was a luxury. Governments had already collapsed. What remained were isolated enclaves, underground facilities, remote mountain bunkers, deep cave systems repurposed as survival shelters. The surface world was unlivable. The winds howled with ash and ice. The sky flickered with meteors and storms. Daylight became a memory. Sunrises were pale shadows. Nights were absolute. In these hidden shelters, humanity shrank. People became ghosts. They whispered stories to their children about a world with beaches and stars and moonlight. Children born in the bunkers had never seen the moon, only heard tales of its beauty, of its betrayal. They studied biology and physics with no real context for the outside world. They learned survival, filtration, hydroponics. They became a species shaped by collapse. The Earth's population had been billions. Now it was likely in the hundreds of thousands, maybe less. In the aftermath of the moon's destruction, Earth became a planet cloaked in shadow. The luminous ring that now circled our world cast shifting halos across the sky, flickering with the motion of debris, a reminder of what was lost and what could never return. It was not a uniform belt of light, but a chaotic swirl of violence, dust, rock, metal, colliding endlessly above the atmosphere. The remnants of our protector now hovered over us like a ghost. Generations passed in silence. The old world faded into legend. Libraries crumbled. Digital archives decayed. Entire languages died. The great cities of humanity, New York, Beijing, Moscow, London, were buried under ash, swallowed by oceans, or shattered by time and fire. Where towers once stood, now jagged ruins stuck out of ice and dust. Where streets once buzzed with life, there was now only silence. Inside the bunkers, life clung to its narrow margins. Small tribes of survivors governed themselves with codes more ancient than law. Cooperation, protection, secrecy. Every watt of energy, every ounce of food, every breath of air was accounted for. Children were not named until they reached a year of age. Death was ritualized. Hope was whispered, rarely spoken aloud. The atmosphere above them remained turbulent. Meteor storms struck at unpredictable intervals. The skies occasionally flared with the entry of lunar fragments, raining fire on what little vegetation remained. Every now and then, a massive impact would throw up so much dust that temperatures dropped further. The glaciers, which had already returned to cover much of Europe and North America, crept steadily southward. Animals, too, had changed. Those that survived adapted or mutated. Albino scavengers hunted beneath clouded skies. Aquatic creatures dominated the coasts, evolving quickly in the new chemical soup of Earth's oceans. Insects, hardy and patient, thrived in caves and cracks, but for humanity it was not thriving. It was enduring. 100 years passed. The ring still encircled the planet, though thinner than before. Earth's gravity slowly pulled at its debris, and over time, some of it re-entered the atmosphere. Much of it burned up in brilliant streaks. Others fell hard and deep, carving new scars into the already bruised crust. But the orbits were decaying. It was no longer a crown. It was a veil falling apart, and as the ring thinned, the light began to return. Sunrises slowly lengthened, shadows softened. The ash, no longer fed by constant volcanoes, began to settle. Some plants pushed through the soil again, mosses, lichens, stunted grasses. Crops grown in hydroponic chambers were moved cautiously back to the surface. Some grew, many didn't. But it was a start. Communities emerged from the underground, not with celebration, but with reverence. They stepped into a world they had never known, one silent, bruised, and cold, but not dead. The sky was not blue, not yet. The stars still flickered faintly through the thin clouds of debris, but the air was beginning to heal. Efforts were made to rebuild, not civilizations, but understanding. Survivors began to map the stars again, carefully noting the changing orbits of ring fragments. Telescopes were salvaged and recalibrated. Children were taught the ancient language of mathematics, not for finance or commerce, but to make sense of the cosmos that had nearly destroyed them. New stories emerged, stories of the moon, once revered, now mourned. It became both a villain and a martyr. Some called it the Great Traitor, others the Great Sacrifice. Rituals formed around its memory. Songs were sung to the broken sky, poems etched into cave walls. Humanity, even now, clung to the need for meaning, for pattern, for myth. And beneath those stories, in the depths of makeshift observatories and wean-battered stations, a new generation of scientists emerged. They were not like the ones of the old world. They were lean, cautious, humble. They knew that technology was no guarantee of survival. They built slowly, instruments made from scavenged metals, data stored in etched stone and crystal, not silicon. They studied not just Earth, but space, the sun, the stars, and Mars, always with one eye watching the remnants of the moon still circling high above. It was these children of the end who began to ask a new question, not what if the moon crashes into Earth, but what comes next? They theorized that in another 1,000 years, Earth's skies might clear completely, the atmosphere would be reborn, photosynthesis would return to full strength. Oceans might rebalance their salinity. And with careful engineering, satellites could one day orbit again. Rockets could be rebuilt. Earth, they believed, could become a spacefaring world once more. But there was a caveat. It could not forget. The collapse of the moon had not only destroyed the planet's surface, it had exposed humanity's arrogance, our belief in permanence, our dependence on the natural order as something guaranteed. The moon, after all, had always been there, until it wasn't. In one quiet observatory high atop what had once been the Andes, a young girl sat beneath a reinforced dome, staring up at the stars. She had never seen the moon, only fragments, but she had read every scrap of history available, every log, every recovered image. She looked not with fear, but with understanding. She scribbled her notes by candlelight and made a decision that would echo through the next chapter of Earth. She would rebuild, not for glory, not for conquest, but for knowledge, for protection, for the remembrance of what came before. Her mission would not be to replicate the old world, but to build a better one, a more humble one that watched the stars with reverence, not conquest, with awe, not greed. She would lead the new age of space not as a conqueror, but as a steward. And one day, if Earth regained its place among the stars, perhaps we would finally understand that the moon wasn't our enemy. It was our mirror, our lesson. A cosmic reminder that nothing, not even something that shines every night, lasts forever. As Earth turned beneath the thinning ring and the ice began to recede, humanity took its first breath in the new era. Not with celebration, but with gratitude and with resolve.